Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am so excited to share the books that I read in the month of January with you. 2023 is off to a great start reading-wise. I read 5 books this month, and then I got really excited with my reading progress and decided to start some chunky, large books that are going to take me a lot longer to finish in the second half of the month. So I'll talk about those a little bit at the end of the video. I'll give you some of my thoughts, though they won't be complete because I haven't finished those books yet. I hope your reading year is off to a great start as well. I would love to hear in the comments the kinds of things you've been reading in the new year. But for now, let's chat about some of the books that I have finished so far this month. The first book that I finished was N or M by Agatha Christie. This is the third Tommy and Tuppence novel of hers, and Tommy and Tuppence are just such vastly underrated characters. They are one of my favorite literary couples of all time. I love the respect and the trust they have for one another. They view marriage as a joint venture, and there's a reason that their second book is called Partners in Crime. They are so wonderful the way they work together and support and play off each other. It's just so fun and rather unique for the time period in which their characters were written. In this installment of Tommy and Tuppence, the characters are a bit older, in their 40s I think, and they have 2 adult children. It's hysterical and ironic because their grown children think of them as boring and unremarkable, and yet the whole premise of this book is that the 2 of them are embroiled in this captivating undercover spy mission during World War II. N or M is a spy thriller where Tommy and Tuppence are recruited to go undercover at the Sans Souci seaside hotel and suss out the identities of the top 2 German spies, who are codenamed N and M. There, they meet a whole host of characters who all seem suspicious in their own right. There's a retired military man, a young German refugee, a foreign hotel manager and her daughter, and so many more colorful characters. The book looks at themes of patriotism and nationalism and fascism in really interesting ways, and although somewhat dated, I think they can be applied and analyzed with regards to current events. The book looks at what it means to put your life on the line for your country, what it means to be ambivalent or feel negatively towards your country's collective identity, and the reader is asked to identify who is the enemy in this text. Is it the English traders, the German refugees, the Irish at the hotel? This book is loaded with suspicion towards everyone and plenty of racism and prejudice that comes with the terse environment of World War II. N or M is an amazing piece of history when you think about it. It was published in 1941 during World War II when things seemed dire, and Agatha Christie and her readers genuinely didn't know the outcome of the war. There's a pervading sense of that societal fear and unease throughout the text. And I find it fascinating how, although very of its time, this book can be used as a lens to think about today's versions of nationalism and patriotism and different societal fears and prejudices and identities that linger today. A fun fact about this book, apparently Agatha Christie was investigated by MI5 after writing it because she named a character Major Bletchley. And Bletchley, of course, is a real place in Britain where the British performed the majority of their code breaking during World War II. And I guess MI5 wondered if Agatha Christie knew something she wasn't supposed to. Christie maintains that she was simply stopped on a train at Bletchley when she named the character. This is just such a fun book, and I was thrilled to revisit Tommy and Tuppence as characters and follow them on this whirlwind of a spy adventure. Something I really like about Agatha Christie is that some of her books are simply mysteries rather than murder mysteries. And it's really refreshing because I feel like most modern books that are mysteries are actually just murder mysteries. And it's fun to see how the genre can do some other things and explore something besides murder. Next up, I have Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows by Bali, Kaur, Jaswal. This sat on my short story shelf in my bedroom for ages, but despite the title, this book is firmly a novel. Sure, it does incorporate elements of so many genres. The Punjabi Widows do tell erotic stories, as the title suggests, and there's a bit of murder and a romance element in here too. But there's an overarching narrative to the story that firmly plants it as a novel in my mind. This is about the character of Nikki, a young Punjabi woman living in West London who one day reluctantly goes to the Sikh temple to post an arranged marriage listing for her sister Mindy. Even though the temple is not really Nikki's scene, she ends up taking a job teaching creative writing to a group of widows at the temple. She soon discovers that this class was falsely advertised to her and that these women she is teaching are illiterate. They don't know how to read or write, with the exception of one or two of them maybe. But they still want a way to pass the time, and they do have stories that they wish to share. And much to Nikki's surprise, these stories are all about erotic fantasy and desire, a topic that one would simply not expect from this group of seemingly traditional Punjabi Sikh women. So yes, erotic stories are a part of this book, and it's definitely not something that I would listen to out loud at work or anything like that. But the strength of this book is how the author uses this quote-unquote writing class and its participants as a tool to examine important themes of community and tradition, of honor, of racism, of the experience of an immigrant in London. She uses the class and the characters to uncover sexism and violence, which is hidden behind this facade of traditionalism and respectability. I loved the mystery element to this book, and as we go through the story, we unearth facts about a rather ghastly suicide, as well as uncover stories of other women who have been oppressed and abused for not keeping in line with the cultural identity that this community tries to cultivate. The book is mainly about modern women navigating the outwardly traditional and conservative community of Southall, London. It's about the clash between the modern and the traditional. It's about generational divides. This book does so much, and somehow it's very fun, and yet simultaneously a very serious read as well. And I felt myself drawn into these characters and this community. This is the first book I've read by this author, but I do have another book of hers on my shelves, The Unlikely Adventures of the Shergill Sisters, which I think is about three sisters who come together after their mother's death to fulfill her last wish, which is a pilgrimage to India to carry out her final burial rites. And I think this author is also coming out with a new book in early March called Now You See Us, which is about Filipina domestic workers in Singapore. And I think there's a murder element in there as well somehow. So I'm very excited to hopefully read more by this author in the future, because this book was really interesting, and I'm curious to see what else this author can accomplish. Next up, I have Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. This book was quite popular a few years back, and it was on my shelves, so I thought I'd give it a try. I actually ended up listening to it on audiobook though, instead of reading it in this lovely print format. It was a really great experience to listen to this on audiobook since the author narrated it himself. I love when authors narrate their own works and are also great narrators. Sometimes authors just aren't great performers, and that's okay, but it can have a really negative impact on my enjoyment of the story. But when authors are also talented performers or speakers, there's something about that audiobook experience that feels really special and intimate, like they're reading their work to you specifically. And this was one of those experiences where the narration really enhanced my experience of the book. Exit West is about two young people, Nadia and Said, who meet and fall in love as their unnamed Middle Eastern country devolves and falls apart in a civil war. As the violence around them escalates and their city becomes uninhabitable and a war zone, the couple hears whispers of these secret, sometimes perilous, guarded doors that can whisk people away to unknown lands and countries, and the couple make the very difficult decision to leave their homeland. As the characters navigate new countries and experiences, they struggle to hold on to each other, to their past, and to their identities independent of their homeland. It's a unique take on the concept of refugees around the world, and on nationalistic reactions towards refugees, on borders and on identity, and on the concept of belonging somewhere and belonging to someone, and most importantly, the loyalty and the courage it takes to accept change in who and what you belong to while still remaining true to yourself. This book was immensely impactful as I was reading it. And like I said earlier, the reading experience itself was rather special, but I simply don't see this as a 5-star book for me. And I don't know if it has long-term staying potential either for me. I think if I had read it in print, I wouldn't have gotten on with the writing style at all. It's rather sparse and clipped and detached, and there's just something about the book that when I reflect back on it, falls short for me. I can't quite put my finger on it. There's a certain sense of detachment while reading the book, which I think Mohsin Hamid's narration compensated for significantly, but there's still something missing here. The idea and the themes are really brilliant, but maybe that's actually the problem. Like, I saw more potential for this book than how it was executed. I still think it was a really interesting read and that it delivered a lot, but I guess I just expected a little more from it based on how it was hyped years ago. And then I read Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw. I listened to this on audiobook to a production performed by LA Theatre Works. They do great audio productions. It's how I listened to all of Oscar Wilde's comedic plays years ago. They are just phenomenal, and if you can listen to one of their productions, I highly recommend it. Pygmalion is a very famous play that I have never read or seen before, nor am I familiar with its more recent variation, My Fair Lady, or the original Greek myth of Pygmalion. I suppose I was familiar with the basic premise of My Fair Lady ahead of time, just kind of as a vague makeover type of Cinderella story. But the play Pygmalion is about a bet that a linguistics expert can transform Eliza Doolittle, a Cockney flower seller off the street, into a refined lady simply through elocution lessons. The play is short and simple and witty and funny and immensely enjoyable, and is probably the best exploration of late Victorian and Edwardian class that I've ever encountered. It's about how people are judged and treated by others based on their clothes and their manners and their speech patterns, but it's so much more than that. As Eliza goes through her elocution lessons and transformation, she begins to realize the limitations of middle and upper class women. She famously states, "I sold flowers. I didn't sell myself. Now you've made a lady of me. I'm not fit to sell anything else." She realizes there are certain freedoms of the working class woman that one has to give up as a respectable lady, and that even though she isn't being forced into prostitution, the object of a respectable lady at the time is to sell a certain image of themselves. The play is all about various transformations and the mutability of class. Is it really manners that make the man or the woman? Eliza's father comes into some money, and although his elocution and manners stay the same, his class changes. So is class determined by the way one acts, by external forces like money, or simply by the way one is treated and respected by others? And then there is a classic Victorian Frankenstein-like element to Eliza's transformation. The linguistics expert, Higgins, is undertaking this bet and, in essence, recreating Eliza. It brings up all sorts of moral questions, like what responsibility does he have towards his creation? and towards protecting her well-being, and what happens when she exerts her independence. Of course, both of those are complicated by gender here, and it's an interesting look at sort of a Frankenstein element in the sense that gender is examined as well. This short play packed such a powerful punch, and it's one that I'd like to own and reread and listen to as well. If you haven't read it yet or want to revisit it, I think it would be really interesting to pair it with Frankenstein or the original Pygmalion myth, of course, which I'm not entirely familiar with. But I think also reading it with a book that comes to mind for me, Flowers for Algernon, could be fascinating as well. I think Pygmalion would pair wonderfully with Flowers for Algernon. I read it in 8th grade, and it has the most unusual poignancy and staying power in my mind. It's about a lab mouse named Algernon who has undergone a surgery to increase his intelligence, and it's about his relationship with Charlie, the first human subject for that same surgery. Like Pygmalion, it's all about transformations and the awareness of your social situation, the awareness of its limitations and how others treat you, the ethical and moral responsibilities that one has towards transforming others. It's such an interesting book, and I love it when books speak to each other in these fascinating ways. So I think maybe if I were to reread Pygmalion, I would also reread Flowers for Algernon. This month, I also read Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. I have seen a lot of people gush about this book on BookTube, and I finally picked it up on a whim. It's the first of the Seven Waters trilogy, which, despite being called a trilogy, is actually 7 books long. I think the author finished the trilogy and then decided to expand the series, but it's still referred to as a trilogy sometimes. I don't know. This one is a bit of a departure from the stuff that I usually read. It's a historical fantasy set in ancient Ireland, full of folklore and enchanting descriptions of the forest. It's about a girl named Sortka, who is the youngest of 7 children and the only daughter in her family. Her mother passed away when she was born, and her father, Lord Callum of Seven Waters, is a very cold and distant Irish warlord. And so it's Sorka's older brothers who care for her and protect her happiness as she grows to be a talented healer, surrounded by and in tune with all of the spirits and fae and fairies in the surrounding forest. But soon their father is bewitched by his new wife, who views the children as a threat, and she puts a terrible spell on the brothers. In order to save her brothers, Sorka must not speak until she completes the dangerous and painful task set by the Lady of the Forest, or she'll lose her beloved brothers forever. And Sorka's journey goes on from there as her fate becomes entangled with 2 brothers from her father's greatest enemy, the Britons. Daughter of the Forest is apparently a loose retelling of Children of Lear, which is from Irish mythology, and the Six Swans fairy tale, both of which I am entirely unfamiliar with, but if that means something to you, perhaps it makes the book more intriguing? I don't know. I found this book to be an incredibly quick and emotional read. The bond between Sorka and her brothers is so moving and powerful. When her brothers are placed under the spell, Sorka feels as though part of herself is gone as well. The mutual devotion and willingness to sacrifice for each other is really touching, and Sorka's journey is painful and gut-wrenching and tragic at times. But ultimately, the book doesn't feel utterly depressing. It's a story of endurance against hunger and loneliness, against bereavement, against sexual assaults. And yet there's this pervading sense of strength and hope amongst Sorka and all of the characters, really, that carries the reader through. I found the writing to be enchanting. It's not particularly flowery or complex, but it's really powerful and it grows on you. And I think that it takes great skill to successfully execute a piece of writing that starts in the first person, but where your narrator is silent for about 2/3 of the book. I don't read too much true fantasy. I do read plenty of books with fantastical elements and such, but not that many books which can be solely considered fantasy. This one, however, really appealed to me because of the vague historical element, because of the booktubers who rave about it, of course, and the romance plot, which I guess I didn't talk about very much, but I absolutely loved. Anyway, my husband does read a lot of fantasy, and after I finished this book, we had a very long chat. I had just finished the book, and I sat there stunned in this very heightened emotional state, and yet when I went to discuss the book, I didn't really have anything to say besides recounting the plot, which is pretty unusual for me. Usually when I finish a book, I want to discuss topics and themes in depth. So my husband and I ended up talking about fantasy as a genre and about how most of the types of books I read handle their exploration of themes very differently from this one. They usually unpack the themes in a very different way, which lends itself to discussion and exposition, but he thinks that fantasy is about feeling the themes rather than displaying them and discussing them. And I really did find that in this book. You engage with the themes on a more emotional level rather than an intellectual level, and you become this empathetic observer. It isn't to say that contemporary fiction or historical fiction or other genres can't be emotional books, because of course many of them are as well. But oftentimes they handle emotional engagement differently than the way that this book affected me, or evoke the same type of emotional engagement, but then also explore their themes in the way I'm used to. Thinking about this book, it actually does deal with important themes of fate and destiny, of personal strength and endurance, of racism and prejudice, of love and sacrifice, but it's not as though you finish the book and have much to say on those topics. Instead, I was stunned by the characters and the plot, and I just sort of internalized the themes, if that makes sense. Anyway, I feel like I'm rambling a lot now and should probably stop. I don't know if I should continue on in this series or make an effort to read more fantasy, or where I'd even start if I wanted to. But that's something I will think about, I guess. So those were all of the books that I finished in January. The first half of January was so great that I decided to embark on some chunky, slower reads for the second half, which I haven't finished yet. So I'm currently working my way through The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters and Nickleby by Charles Dickens on audiobook. I'm enjoying Nickleby, but I think that I'm missing a lot of detail and plot points because I'm listening to it on audiobook while driving mostly and while being rather distracted. I've made peace with that though for this particular Dickens book. I don't have a physical copy for this one, and I'm currently going through an oddly anti-e-reader phase. So it just makes sense, and I'm really enjoying Nickleby at the moment. And I haven't really gotten swept up by The Paying Guests yet. I'm 100 pages in, and I was really hoping for one of Sarah Waters' more fast-paced books, but I'm getting an exquisitely written, slowly developing, character-driven book instead. Still, I think it might take a sudden turn or pick up in some way, because the back of the book has all of these quotes. Stephen King wrote a quote on it that said something about having several sleepless nights, and there's another quote on the back of it that says it's a classic Gothic page-turner, and I'm just not getting that from what I've read so far. So I'm not stopping with this book until I figure out what they're going on about, because that's just not my experience at all within the first 100 pages. And I'm excited to see how this book, which seems like such a slow, character-driven book, will possibly turn into a thriller-esque Gothic novel. So that's what I read in January. That's what's happening with my reading life right now. I do hope that your 2023 reading year is off to a great start as well. What did you read? What are you currently reading? Have you read any of the books that I mentioned here? And if so, what did you think of them? You know, I'm always curious to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below about anything and everything that I've discussed. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another bookish video very soon. Bye!